This lecture is on prejudice, discrimination, and stereotyping. Um, and, really, these are not the most pleasant topics, but it's, of course, very important to understand the psychological reasons why we have the stereotypes that we do, why we have prejudice belief, and, the reasons that lead people to discriminate against others. So these have been very important topics in social psychology, in the field of psychology in general. And so to be sure, everybody wants to be seen as an individual and for who they are. And it doesn't feel good when people put a label on us. Yet we know that it happens all the time. People put other people into groups and categories and then use category labels to inform their beliefs or evaluation of that person kind of as a whole. In other words, we use a category label to make judgments about the person. And while it's a typical and in some cases natural thing to do, we know that it can result in some very negative consequences. So this lecture is going to focus on biases against different social groups, and social psychologists sort these biases into uh, emotional prejudices, stereotypes, and then behavioral discrimination. So, the overview of this lecture, I'm going to introduce concepts as well as go over key terms. I'm going to review two personality traits that are related to prejudice, including reviewing some research that I've done in the past on the topic. I'll then review subtle biases. So, most of the bias beliefs that we have today in modern society are characterized as subtle, and there's these three characteristics of subtle biases, which is that they're ambiguous, automatic, and ambivalent, and then talk briefly about some ways to reduce prejudice and discrimination. So, after hearing this lecture, you should be able to know the definitions and therefore be able to distinguish between prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination, be able to distinguish the difference between overt and blatant biases versus subtle bias, understand two personality traits related to bias, which are social dominance orientation and right-wing authoritarianism, understand that subtle unexamined biases are automatic, ambiguous, and ambivalent in what those things mean, and then understand when it's possible to reduce prejudice. So here's the key terms. Prejudice is an evaluation or emotion towards people merely based on their group membership. So this is an emotion or an affect. Discrimination is behavior that advantages or disadvantages people based on their group membership. So discrimination is a behavior. And then a stereotype is a belief that characterizes people based merely on their group membership. So that's a cognition. So what you'll notice here in the parentheses where we have affect, which is another word for emotion, affect, behavior, and cognition, we have the ABCs of attitudes. So what we're talking about with stereotypes and prejudice and discrimination is ultimately people have attitudes that are positive or negative about other people. Okay, so there's both the cognitive part of that as well as the emotional part of that, and then those attitudes serve as a guide for behavior, which is discrimination. So we have this, clear line of sight with the way that we've defined attitudes as well as having an affective, a behavioral, and a cognitive component, the ABCs. All right, so the biases that we have can be described as either blatant or subtle. And blatant biases are really what we would consider the old-fashioned type. Very few people, at least in the U.S. and many kind of Western cultures, would explicitly endorse these negative evaluations of other social groups. Okay, so when we talk about blatant biases, we're talking about conscious beliefs, feelings, and behaviors that people are perfectly willing to admit that are mostly negative or hostile, and that openly favor their own group. Um, and so, as I said, these are mainly considered old-fashioned, and that very few people in our modern society would be willing to openly admit that they have hostile feelings against other groups. Of course, some people do, as in the group pictured here, but but most people don't. Um, so, depending on how widespread these blatant beliefs are and how widespread these blatant biases are, they can impact not only our society's kind of conscious feelings about others, but also our laws. So, the United States is one of the only countries in the world that actually guarantees equality in its Constitution. Unfortunately, in the Constitution, equal protection under the law only applied to a select group of people, which was white male landowners. Fortunately, equal protection under the law has been defined by different shifts in ideology and social values over the years. So the women's suffrage movement, the civil rights movement. So this has really been a response to changes in feelings, and that there's biases that are no longer widely accepted by society. So whereas it used to be normative and even part of the law, now our social norms reject the former institutions that used to be in this country. Like, we used to have slavery, we used to have segregation, we used to deny women the right to vote. So these were conventions, these were laws, but they're not anymore because of the ideological shift in social values. A more recent example, of course, in one of these changes in bias and changes in ideology has been over marriage equality. And so I would say that the social kind of norms and conventions have shifted, and the result was, of course, a Supreme Court decision that made same-sex marriage legal in all 50 states. So in many ways, these old-fashioned biases were simple. Earlier in our country, okay, so 150 years ago, people were just more likely to openly discriminate against people outside of their own group, and it was more tolerated and more accepted. Fortunately, there's been cultural and societal shifts. These blatant biases still remain, though, and let's not pretend that they don't. So while there has been overall shifts, there still are people that maintain these blatant biases, and in particular, psychologists have been able to identify two personality traits that are linked to having these blatant biases, and these personality traits have been linked to prejudice and discrimination. So the first one of these personality traits is called social dominance orientation. Social dominance orientation is the belief that group hierarchies are inevitable, and that they're inevitable in all societies, and that hierarchies are necessary and even a good idea in order to maintain order and stability. Okay, so people high in social dominance orientation think that, there's basically this ladder, there's a hierarchy, and some groups are on top and some groups are on the bottom, and that's a good thing because it helps society be orderly and basically to function. So people that believe in social dominance orientation have the belief that some groups are inherently superior to others and some groups are inferior. So the idea is that the groups that are on top of the hierarchy are the ones that are superior, and the ones that are on the bottom are inferior. And so in previous lectures, we've learned about measuring personality through self-report, so giving people surveys or inventories or questionnaires, and that's a way to measure different personality traits. Social dominance orientation is measured in this way, typically using a self-report methodology. And so inventories that measure social dominance orientation will include statements like this: An ideal society requires some groups to be on top and others to be on the bottom. Okay, here's another item. Some groups of people are simply inferior to other groups. So somebody high in social dominance orientation marks that they agree with items like that. People that are low in social dominance orientation mark that they disagree with statements like that. So what do we know about people that are higher in social dominance orientation? Well, one thing is that professionally they choose occupations that maintain group hierarchy. And so people higher in social dominance orientation are more likely to be police officers. If they're lawyers, they'll be a prosecutor. They'll often go into industry and try to be a leader or a CEO of a big company or a business. Alternatively, people that score lower in social dominance orientation tend to pick occupations that are based more on equalizing, you would say, differences between people. So they go into things like social work. If they're a lawyer, they would be a public defender. People lower in social dominance orientation tend to go into psychology. So a part of social dominance orientation is the belief that hard work pays off and that leisure is a waste of time. And so this comes from the belief, like one of the things that underlies social dominance orientation is the belief that the world is a difficult place. The world is tough, it's competitive, and that you've got different groups in society that are kind of fighting each other for limited resources. So relationships between different groups of people are really about competition over economic resources. That's not the worst idea in and of itself, but what is not so great about social dominance orientation is that people that are high in social dominance orientation assume that the superiority of the dominant group is in some way justified or deserved. So in other words, those that are at the top of the hierarchy got there because they're somehow tougher or smarter or more deserving. Okay, those at the bottom of the hierarchy are there because they're supposed to be, because they didn't work as hard, they're not as smart, or they're less deserving. Okay, so that's kind of the problematic inference that people with social dominance orientation make. Okay, and it's problematic because in Western societies and in the US, when we kind of look at who sits on top of this social hierarchy, it tends to be people that are white, that are men, that would be native-born US citizens, that would be heterosexual, that would be Christian. Okay, so what that means is that people that believe that, hey, people that are on top are deserving of that, it means that those categories, people high in social dominance orientation would value those categories more. And then alternatively, people that are racial ethnic minorities, people that are women, people that are immigrants, people that are homosexual, people that are non-Christian are viewed as inferior and less deserving of, of being on top of the hierarchy and more deserving of being at the bottom of the hierarchy, according to this orientation. So it's important to know that social dominance orientation is related to, that is, it correlates with people's political orientations. Okay, so you do tend to find that people higher in social dominance orientation are more likely to be conservative and are more likely to be Republican, but not perfectly. Okay, so not all Republicans are high in social dominance orientation. Many, even most, are not. So there is some correlation with political conservatism, but it's not perfect. And as you might expect, people that score higher in social dominance orientation generally score lower in things like tolerance, empathy, altruism, and community orientation. All right. So the second personality trait related to bias is a trait known as right-wing authoritarianism. People that are high in this trait endorse respect for obedience and authority in service of group conformity and focus on group unity over individual rights. So, right-wing authoritarianism is measured in the same way using a personality inventory. And so, on a questionnaire or on an inventory, people are given statements like this: our country desperately needs a mighty leader who will do what has to be done to destroy the radical new ways and sinfulness that are ruining us. The only way our country can get through the crisis ahead is to go back to our traditional values, put some tough leaders in power, silence the troublemakers spreading bad ideas. Okay, so somebody who scores high in right-wing authoritarianism would answer that they agree with these items. People that score low in right-wing authoritarianism would answer that they disagree with these items. Okay, and so you can think about people's social values and their political values and how that kind of corresponds to this personality trait of right-wing authoritarianism, and how that might lead some people to have a preference for certain political leaders. Okay, if you think about who the political leaders in our country are now, other political leaders across the world, different time points and periods, of course, but in our current period, you can think about certain people as being high versus low in this trait and who they might like to see as, for example, President of the United States. All right, so just to summarize both social dominance orientation and right-wing authoritarianism, we can talk about the core beliefs of both. So for social dominance orientation, the core belief is that groups compete for economic resources. Let me just stick with social dominance orientation. Because of the core belief that groups compete for economic resources, it leads to the belief that group hierarchies are inevitable and even good. And that's the core kind of belief about how groups relate to one another. And so in terms of the in-group, the idea is that, the group that I belong to, you have to be tough or competitive. And the out-group belief is that they are trying to beat us. And so you can see that this leads to stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination and negative and hostile feelings about out-groups if you view the world as a competition and that your goal is to be, kind of tougher, to maintain a hierarchy, to try to get on top. Right-wing authoritarianism, the core belief is that group values trump all else. Trump is an interesting word in this context. The intergroup belief is that groups must follow authority. That's the idea, is that you follow your leader. So in terms of in-group, that is the group that I belong to, it's necessary to unite and protect our position. And outsiders, that is they or others, have bad ideas that are trying to, kind of infiltrate and ruin the harmony or the traditionalism that is an important part of our group or my group. Okay. So in the past, when I was in graduate school, I've actually done some research on right-wing authoritarianism. And so it's been quite a while now, back in 2006, but I actually published a research study with one of my graduate advisors, as well as fellow graduate students, looking at the relationship between right-wing authoritarianism and prejudice. And specifically, we were interested in people's reactions after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And we were really interested to know how people would react and whether having this terrorist event would lead people to support different government policies that could be seen as very prejudiced and biased and even dangerous. And so in particular, we were interested in this personality trait of right-wing authoritarianism, and whether after the 9/11 attacks, people who were higher in right-wing authoritarianism would be more likely to want to expand the war against terrorism, not just in Afghanistan, not just in Afghanistan, but outside of Afghanistan to Iraq. And then whether people that were higher versus lower in right-wing authoritarianism would be more willing to support government policies like deporting people, saying like, you just can't live in the U.S. anymore. We're deporting you to your home country. So we had a large sample, a large nationally representative sample of over 500 people. We measured right-wing authoritarianism using a previously developed inventory. We asked people questions very similar to the ones that you previously saw. We measured people's emotional reactions after 9/11. So specifically, we measured anger by asking respondents the degree to which they currently felt anger, outrage, and hatred in response to the terrorist attacks. But we also wanted to know whether they felt afraid. And so we measured fear by asking the extent to which they currently felt frightened and vulnerable and confused in response to terrorist attacks. Okay, and then our two outcome measures. The first was support for expanding the war. We said we asked people the extent to which they agreed that the war on terrorism should be expanded to Iraq and other countries suspected of harboring and supporting terrorists. So that is expanding the war beyond just Afghanistan. And then the other question was the extent to which they supported deportation policies. So they were asked the extent to which they agreed or disagreed with the idea that certain groups, including Arab Americans, Muslims, and first-generation immigrants, should be deported from our country. So what you have here are the statistical results, okay? And so the numbers represent correlations, and you'll see that all the numbers are positive, which just means that the variables are positively associated or are positively related to one another. So what we see here is a positive correlation between right-wing authoritarianism and support for expanding the war. That is, people that score higher in right-wing authoritarianism are more likely to say that they would like to expand the war against terrorism than are people that are lower. And we were able to explain this by their feelings of anger. Okay, so what we see is that being right-wing authoritarianism, those folks were more likely to experience anger after the 9/11 attacks. And anger was predictive or associated with support for expanding the war. So we can explain this by saying that after the 9/11 attacks, people that were higher in right-wing authoritarianism were more likely to experience anger, and it was that anger that was partially responsible for being supportive of policies to expand the war on terror to Iraq, and we know what happened. Interestingly, it was a different emotion that led people that were higher in right-wing authoritarianism to support deportation. So people that were higher in right-wing authoritarianism were also more likely to feel fear. Okay, so both angry and afraid. Not a good combination. Okay, and it was those fear reactions that were more predictive of the specific policy to want to deport people that were Arab American, Muslim, and even first-generation immigrants, which is crazy because, what do first-generation immigrants have to do with terrorism? Most of the first-generation immigrants in the United States are from Mexico, so it doesn't even correspond. So you can see how how unfortunate and how confused these attitudes are. So there we have it. Previous research showing that this personality trait is related to bias, related to prejudicial beliefs, and in part we can explain that through experiencing these negative emotions of anger and fear after this event. All right. So thus far we've really been talking about more overt or blatant prejudice, and so now we're going to shift to what's actually more common in today's culture, which is to have subtle biases. So when we talk about subtle biases, what we're referring to are unexamined and often unconscious biases that we have inside of us that have real-world consequences in terms of how people treat other people in the society that they live. So there's three features of these subtle biases. which is that they're ambiguous, they're automatic, and they're ambivalent. And so I'll go into detail about each of these three. I think actually starting with automatic instead of ambiguous. Yes. So, so by automatic, we mean that biases are unintended, they're immediate, and they're irresistible, as in you can't control these biases from coming to mind. An example of an automatic bias is known as an own group preference. So most people, to some extent, identify themselves as members of certain groups, but not others. And logically, because we like ourselves, we therefore like the groups that we belong to more than other groups. And so whether we're talking about, by groups, what do we mean? We could be talking about people from our own hometown, people, that we go to school with, people that are our same religion, but even much bigger groups or categories, like people that are the same gender as us or the same ethnicity. Okay, so the point is, we generally like the groups to which we belong, and a part of that is it's just human nature. However, there's an unfortunate consequence, which is because we prefer our own groups, we like other groups less. And this is problematic because it leads to prejudice and discrimination. So social psychologists have developed several ways to measure own group preference, with the most famous and widely used being the implicit association test, or IAT, implicit association test. So pictured here is an actual screenshot from the IAT. This one is designed to test a person's reaction time to an array of stimuli that are presented on the screen. This particular item is testing an individual's unconscious or implicit reactions towards members of different ethnic groups. Here's the way it works. The IAT presents respondents with pairs of concepts. So for example, it will pair together European American and good or African American and bad. It'll then flip those pairings and it will pair European American and bad and African American and good. People are then either shown a face or an adjective, and their job is to put it in either one of the categories. Okay. So in this particular example, the task is just to hit a key on the keyboard and say, is this a face of an African American person or a European American person? In other situations, there will be an adjective, okay, like nice, that is presented, and the job is to say, is that a good word or a bad word, okay, or angry, is that a good or a bad? So what the IAT attempts to do is get us a measure of how strongly associated two types of concepts are. The more strongly associated, the more rapidly one should be able to respond. And so indeed, what this shows is that people are more likely respond more quickly to an African American face when it is paired with African American or bad than it is with African American or good. Or they respond more quickly to a white face when the category is European American or good versus European American or bad. Okay, so looking at those differences between reaction times when the pairings are paired, when the words are paired different ways, gives a sense of how strongly associated the concepts are in people's brains. So there have been IATs that have developed to measure implicit bias in several different categories, like biases like an old-young bias, or a sexuality bias, Arab American bias. So if you want, you can take one of these IATs by going to this website, and it's worth doing. I've done it. It's very informative to see what the results are. Unfortunately, when we get the results from many people, and there's been thousands of people that have taken these tests, unfortunately, what this IAT shows is that it consistently finds that people show a preference for more socially valued groups. Okay, so people generally show, and based on this reaction time, when these categories are paired, people generally have faster reaction times when the socially valued categories are paired with like good words versus bad words. So results from this test have been taken as strong evidence by social psychologists and really the field of psychology in general that people have automatic biases that they're often unaware of and that might be difficult to control. All right, let's talk about the next feature of subtle biases. Okay, so the IAT indicates that people spontaneously favor their own in-group at the expense of the other. And so, according to social identity theory and self-categorization theory, we categorize ourselves and others into groups, and we end up favoring our in-group, and we show less of a preference for out-groups. And so specifically what social identity theory says is that people categorize each other into groups, and we favor our own group. As a result, we dislike the out-group because we like our in-group. Now, it's not that we necessarily like actively punish or try to harm out-group members as much as just we kind of like neglect or avoid them in favor of our own group. Okay, the idea would be that we need to still justify this preferential treatment, and so we often exaggerate the differences between our own group and out groups. And it's this idea which is the basis for self-categorization theory, which is, and the idea here is that people categorize themselves along with each other into groups favoring their own group. So both basically say the same thing, is that we categorize ourselves into in-groups, we categorize others into out-groups, and we will end up favoring our own group. This is called an ambiguous bias because we end up disfavoring or discriminating outgroups by exclusion or neglect, rather than trying to do active harm. And this stems from the natural tendency to be more comfortable with people like ourselves. So for example, a hiring manager who's a white male might decide to offer the job to another white male over other people. And this might be done not necessarily out of a conscious desire to harm others, but because of the simple, I would even say natural tendency to be more comfortable with somebody like closer to himself. Let's be clear, that's still discrimination, and I think most of us would agree that's racist behavior, okay? But it's ambiguous. It's psychologists have the term that they use is ambiguous because it's to differentiate preference towards one's own group is the thing that results in discrimination, not kind of like this active or blatant harm, okay? So a specific case of comfort with the in-group is called aversive racism. And it's called this because people don't like to admit their own racial biases to themselves or others. So people that are high in aversive racism are truly uncomfortable with people outside of their group. But they're also very uncomfortable to admit that to themselves because of, in our modern society, it is very much frowned upon to have prejudice or racial beliefs. So aversive racism is unexamined racial bias that a person has, okay? That they're just unaware of their biases. And in fact, they would not intend to be racist. They would reject the idea that they are racist, but kind of having this fear of being racist actually have people high in aversive racism will avoid interracial contact, okay? So it's kind of like they know it, but they're not willing to admit it, okay? That'd be somebody that scores high in aversive racism. All right, so let's talk about the third characteristic. So this last feature of our modern biases is that they're complicated. There's many factors as well as biases that work together to shape our perceptions of people from other group and determine our attitudes toward them. And that often happens in contradictory ways. So one thing that is a little bit complicated is not all stereotypes are necessarily bad. For example, Asian Americans are sometimes considered the model minority, and stereotypically there's many like positive traits that are ascribed to Asian Americans, like hardworking, successful. Okay, still stereotypes, but the stereotype of being hardworking isn't like a negative stereotype. It's a positive quality. Okay. The other thing is that the prejudice that we feel or that people feel, which is an emotion, can be ambivalent, which means like there's a mixture of feelings. So, for example, people will feel like pity towards people that have a disability, okay, either a physical or a mental disability, and may even feel compassionate towards those people. However, that's disrespectful at the same time. So there's this weird ambivalence in a mixture towards other groups. So the stereotype content model is a way to understand these mixed feelings. Specifically, the model uses two dimensions, which are warmth and competence, as a way to understand people's perceptions of others. Okay, so in terms of the warmth dimension, if the other group is perceived to have good cooperative intentions, they're considered warm and trustworthy. Okay, so they're on our side. Otherwise, low warmth, otherwise known as cold, people from a group that would be considered cold are thought of as our competitors, or even people that might exploit our own group. They're not on our side. So we feel warmth towards people that we can trust, that are on our side. Even if they're not in our group, they're on our side. And we feel cold feelings, low warmth, towards people that would be our competitors. The other dimension would be the competence-incompetence dimension. So the idea is that after we try to discover an outgroup member's intentions, okay, like are they on our side or not? Do I feel warm or cold towards this person? We want to know whether they are competent, okay, so whether they would act on their intentions. So if they're perceived to be incompetent, then they matter to us less in a way because they're less of a threat. But if they're competent, that would be very threatening. Okay, that an outgroup member that is competent, and especially one that we would feel cold feelings towards because they're not on our side, would be considered a threat. And so what you see is that these two dimensions, warmth and competence, provide a map to how we feel about outgroup members. So, and the types of kind of like reactions and emotions that we feel. So, for example, one combination is high warmth, but low competence. And so one example that would fit this combination would be disabled people or also older people. And so the idea is that others report pitying people in this group, but only so long as they stay in their place, okay? Like, don't try to ask for too much, right? It's just like, we feel pity, they're not a threat, and so that's the emotion that we feel towards these people. At the other end of the warmth dimension would be like homeless people or drug addicts. They're commonly stereotyped as not having good intentions, like perhaps because they want to try to like not play by the rules or get away with stuff. And likewise, they're viewed as being incompetent, so somehow like responsible for their situation because they weren't able to do anything useful. And so reactions to people that are drug addicts or homeless are usually one of disgust. Um, Groups characterized as competent but not warm, for example, would be people that are rich and outsiders, people that are good at business. Asian Americans, as the model minority, are often put in this category. So they're seen as competent but cold. And this makes people feel envious, having to admit that these people have talent, but resenting people in this group for kind of not being like us, not being warm, not being sociable, things like that. So this model explains the mixed emotions that people with biases may feel towards certain groups. So people that are sexist, okay, that harbor biases against women, they might actually feel kind and benevolent towards traditional women, right, like a housewife, but they would get hostile towards air quotes non-traditional women that would say want to be successful in business. Okay, so sexism can be both there can be a benevolent form of sexism where it's like, oh, people that have those benevolent sexism beliefs feel warm feelings towards a woman that would play a more traditional role, and would feel negative feelings towards a woman that would play a less stereotypically traditional role. Similarly, people that are racist might feel paternalistic towards Black or Latino people. Okay, unfortunately, I hate to say this, but I often encounter this among educators, is that people that are educators and are racist often have very low kind of expectations of Black and Latino students, and end up being in this kind of paternalistic, is like, oh, you got to take care and you can't expect so much. Okay, and which is really unfortunate, because then it's also with these other mixed feelings of thinking that Black and Latino students are not as hardworking, or they don't care about school. Um, and then people that have stereotypes against the old, so people that are ageist, um, would say feel like a fondness for old people, like, oh, old people are just, I just love them so much, and oh, like, aren't they so sweet, or this or that, but then simultaneously might feel resentment that an older person would consume resources, okay, like Social Security or Medicare benefits, or whatever it is, okay? So it's people that are sexist, racist, and ageist can have these mixed emotions, these mixed beliefs and feelings. All right, so here's a summary. Um, and so just with examples of the ways that we uh, theorize as well as measure automatic, ambiguous, and ambivalent biases, and basically what each of these show. All right, so the question is, can we change stereotypical beliefs? And unfortunately, it's difficult. What researchers have found is that when people are presented with an example or two that seems to refute their existing stereotype, most don't change their general belief. And some research has found that when people are presented with disconfirming evidence, it actually strengthens their stereotypical beliefs. Okay, so I would like to give you more optimistic news, but what psychological research suggests is that it's very difficult to change people's beliefs in general, and it's very difficult, and therefore it's very difficult to change the stereotypes that people have about people. Why is this the case? It's because people are very motivated not to be wrong. Okay, we have these very strong biases towards protecting our self-esteem and our egos. And so we don't like to be wrong, or we don't like to feel like we're stupid. And so when we're presented with evidence that would challenge our beliefs, we have these kind of built-in mechanisms to then come up with additional reasons for holding the beliefs that we do. So people counter-argue and try to refute when they're challenged. Okay, so the take home here, it's very difficult to change stereotypical beliefs, but it doesn't mean that we can't. And in fact, there's been research in social psychology that does show that under appropriate conditions, interaction and contact with members of other groups can actually reduce prejudice, and specifically between majority and minority groups. Okay, so we can reduce prejudice and discrimination under the right circumstances. What are those circumstances? You need to get groups together to work towards a common goal. It's one that could be, working on a task um, uh, that is important to both groups, and it can only be attained if both groups work together by coming together and sharing their efforts and sharing their resources. Okay, and it would be a goal that benefits both groups. Okay, so that's called a superordinate goal, and that's the necessary thing. Okay, so people need to work together on that goal. The groups need to have equal status. Okay, so group members should be roughly similar in their backgrounds and their characteristics. So whether that's their education, their skill, their wealth, whatever it is, ideally you want roughly equal status in those two things. They need to work together without competing. They need to. Works better when members of one group know individually multiple members of the other group. And that there's generally social norms that encourage this equality of the two groups. So that's when contact works best. The short of it is you can't just throw people together and say, hey, get to know each other. That is insufficient. You have to have these certain conditions where these members of different groups really need to work together towards a common goal, and that can build better relationships. Here's a couple examples of research supporting the contact hypothesis. I think that this is a really interesting one, is that white athletes who played team sports with others from different backgrounds report less prejudice than athletes that play individual sports. So presumably, working with people from other backgrounds towards a common goal and roughly equal status, you're on the same team, reduces prejudice. Some other examples that doesn't quite have all the elements of the contact hypothesis, but it's still supportive. In the 1980s, when homosexuality was more stigmatized, research had college students have a pleasant interaction with somebody that was openly gay, and after that interaction, they came away being more likely to accept homosexuals or that as a group. And then more recently in the Netherlands, which, by the way, Europe has had a lot of immigration from different countries, and so there's people of the Muslim background that have immigrated to different countries of Europe. That has resulted in a fair amount of discrimination and prejudice against people of the Muslim faith. So researchers in Europe, and in particular the Netherlands, wanted to study people that lived in neighborhoods with high numbers of Muslims. So the idea here is that there's contact, and in living in the same neighborhood, you generally have the same goals, right? You want your neighborhood to be safe, and you want it to be clean. You want to have a nice neighborhood, so that there's some superordinate goal there. What they found is that among Dutch people that lived in neighborhoods that have higher numbers of Muslim, they express lower perceived threats, right? Because the stereotypes is that there's terrorists and things like that. So having contact with people of Muslim faith lowered their perception of that group as a threat. So some evidence there. So, okay, that's it for this lecture. I hope that after hearing it, you have a better idea of how social psychologists have come to understand and think about stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination.